Welcome to Climate on the Ballot, the live show. It is season 4 of the Environmentally Speaking podcast. This season is Climate on the Ballot, where we go directly to the issues that affect you as the voter. We know that climate change issues aren't usually talked about or centralized during the election season, and that's what we want to focus on for our podcast this year. With me is Gishan Johnson. Introduce yourself, Gishan.
Hello, hi David. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, my name is Gishan Johnson. Where do I start? A climate enthusiast, an environmentalist. I have my background in geography, geology, higher learning in environmental science, and now I am kind of in the area of policy that looks at science, telecoms, transport, and is kind of helping, I guess, the country or my community with policy coherence and all of that. So I think that's who I am, and I'm here in Kingston in my small apartment, excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thanks. And I'm David Hilton. I really should remember to introduce myself. Okay. Um, I wanted us to have this discussion around climate, elections, and then specifically education, which is our last episode that just aired. But let's talk about climate and the election first, because I've never seen it as an issue that's been represented. And that's one of the reasons why I don't really vote because I don't see the issues that I care about being represented on the ballot. I just want to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I agree with you. It boggles my mind to believe that, our elected leaders, officials still haven't grasped the the conversation or grasp the gravity of how impactful climate change will have on everything that they're campaigning on. All the developmental promises are hinged on climate change, and nobody has been able to tie that with the fact that we have to address the issues that deal with climate change. I get the impression that they're fatigued or they just don't have the language or the tools to relate to the Jamaican people or to make it into a campaign promise or into election policy or promise that is relatable to the people. And I guess it's a bit of our responsibility as civil service and as advocates and activists to kind of connect with the people, make it a bread and butter issue. I've heard that language before, making climate change a bread and butter issue. And I think we have a little bit of responsibility to make it a bread and butter issue. And we have been for a long time. And let's not be too arrogant or disrespectful to think that the Jamaican people don't understand what climate change is. They might not have the fancy language that we use, but if you speak to them on a one-to-one basis, they will give you example. They will tell you, the farmers will tell you that, seasons have changed and the yields have changed and things are not the same. Fisher folks will tell you the same as well. But definitely, it's not a big ticket item on the ballot most times. And I think something has to change. Something has to give.
Definitely. So it may not be a bread and butter issue on its own, but then it touches on everything, and that is the idea behind this season that we're going to look through the lens of the specific topics that people consider to be bread and butter issues and then interlace it with the climate change issues. So last episode was on education and we spoke to Dr. Bramwell Layla, who is a lecturer at UWI who trains science teachers to go into the classroom, and Jada Houghton, who's a member of the JCCYC, who has been instrumental in our podcast before and is now also a science teacher. So we wanted to talk about what it's like inside the classrooms in terms of the effects of climate change, but also what about climate education? What about the how the syllabus treats climate change? So it's both a real issue that students are facing and the theoretical that they need to learn to be able to go out into the workplace and also just live in society under all of this. So I wanted to talk about our own climate education journeys first so that we can contextualize because the entire reason for us to meet on this live is for us to break down the topics. Yes, we speak to our expert guests every other week, but we also want to hear from the public, being that it's climate on the ballot. So today we're talking with anyone who wants to join in or Zoom or on the live. You can comment on the YouTube live as well. What's your education journey been like, your climate education journey? And uh, I'll start with you, Gishan, and then Gabrielle and Rodrina, if you want to join in, other members from the JCCYC, we are glad to have you. Go ahead, Gishan.
Yeah, I think my journey, my climate education journey, probably started later than the younger generation now. I think my first introduction to it holistically was probably university first year, where I majored in geology, and so I did geography and conservation biology as minor as well. And so it was unavoidable. So I went directly into it. Some of the knowledge that I learned then was very much new materials coming out, now making it into the space of academia, and it was very much new to me. I don't recall if I was introduced to it in high school, maybe, but high school is a blur, so we're not we're really not counting that, you know. So it's possibly at first year university where this brand new idea to me. We heard of global warming, and let's we as a kid we hear about global warming. The ice caps are melting. There's a hole in the ozone layer. So I think as kids growing up, we knew about that. There was a popular song in Jamaica as well. There's a hole in the ozone layer. So we know about that. But global warming, we it has changed from just global warming to what to climate change. You know, we hear that the hole in the ozone layer has been dramatically reduced, but climate change is still happening. The Anthropocene, where the effects of climate as we know it, the weather pattern as we know it, has been significantly altered because of human induced activities. And this made it into the science record and now became material or became a part of academia. And that was first introduced to me in um, university. And just a natural progression, it became something that I was interested in. Also because I worked in this space, learned in this space, and so that's where my journey really began.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for sharing that. High school and primary school was also a blur for me, but I do think that we learned a little about global warming in primary school. But it was the very clinical definition, not the human and social impacts that we're seeing today, or we know more specifically today, or we know intimately today. It was just this is a science concept, and this is, you have the definition. Then by high school now, it didn't really seem as if it was part of the full-on curriculum to go as deep as we did. I really believe that I benefited from having some of the best teachers. There was this biology teacher called Miss Lawson, who she was very environmentally conscious. She used to run the environmental club as well. And I was big in that. So everyone knew me as the Enviro girl and Save the Planet and Captain Planet. Um, but it was a really good experience, and we used to plant, we used to label our trees and gardens. Um, Westwood was a completely beautiful gardenia, because in large part to Miss Lawson. Um, and we had a great chemistry teacher that we entered into competitions with. So we had these things where we would create these solutions. I remember we created a stove that ran on water instead of gas. And the year after, they created some thermal cracking for recycling plastics. And then after I left, they did a whole project where they went into communities to try to get students little children to understand
Uh-huh.
the gutters, like not dumping in the gutters because it piles up and stuff. And they realized that, when you go to children, it broadens the scope in the home, it changes how people behave. So they created a model and showed them what would happen if the gullies keep piling up. So I went to a school that cared about those issues. And I really
Hmm.
felt that's just luck. I don't think that we put so much emphasis on it that it becomes like a must. I think in Jamaica in general, or maybe in general as well, it's not just us. there isn't enough oversight within the classroom for us to really say everyone's getting an equal opportunity to learn. I think it really just depends on who you get. And who I got were amazing teachers. But I did go to another school for sixth form where that was not the case. It was a bigger school, a more, you know, what people call um in Kingston, and the level of teaching was different. The level of connection with the material was different. And then for university, even though I started out in science education, it was more of an aside for climate change. Right? There was one course dedicated to it, and then some of my science education courses would mention it, but over on the science side, because they split it really, we studied science and then we studied education, or then we studied science education. But when we were over on in the science faculty, there was none of that connectedness. It's just a clinical um,
Mm-hmm.
examination of anything scientific. So most of what I know about the human and social impacts of climate change is from activism, it's from being involved with the council. And I think that it makes a difference when you go into the classroom with the affective domain in mind, how you connect to students, how they feel about things. But I want to hear from anybody else as well. What's your journey with climate education? Go ahead, Regina.
Oh, it's still morning. Good morning, everyone. Uh, Thank you for having me, guys. And hello, Jashawn. Lovely to see you as well. Um, my exposure, much like Jashawn's, was mostly at university. I feel like, through primary and high school, it was just a box to tick specifically, to get through my CXCs, my GSAT, everything. But when I got to university and I was studying architecture at the time, it became imperative. I had a lecturer, Mr. Barr, he's now the head of school at UTech for the built environment. It was a requirement for us to have a specific sheet for sustainability. Like you would go into your crit, some they sometimes call it juries, where you have like architectural professionals and your lecturers come to critique your work, and it would be a big thing. Where is your climate sheet? How are you going to build and design a structure or a building within the Caribbean region and not have a climate sheet? Where you're going to put your shading, where you're going to put your awnings, like how are you going to account for passive cooling, all of that options. Like, it wasn't until university where I was like, okay, all right, it's a part of my life now.
I love that. I am so glad to hear that there are people who are making it clear for students that it's a part of your life and you have to include it. From our interview with Dr. Brammer Layla, we know now that they are training new teachers with that in mind. In fact, for their practicum courses, they are encouraged to go in with a climate project to the schools that they're visiting. So it's good to know that there are changes. I was in Dr. Brummel's Layla class when I was learning science education, but at that time, I believe it was a new course that's been a new double major, and it was quite a lot of stress. So we weren't really focused on those practical aspects that. So now things are changing. It's out there. People are interacting with it in a different way. Uh, Let me know if you'd like to share as well. We have one other guest, Gabrielle, or Vice President.
Hi, good morning to everyone, and good morning to our viewers also on YouTube. So, for me, for my climate change journey, it started pretty early in high school actually. So, at my high school, similarly to you with your primary school, where there was a significant focus, in my high school, there was a significant focus in different environmental clubs, right? So, we had a club called ICE, and anything related to cleaning the environment, to taking care of our fellow wildlife and everything, that was highlighted. And even as a running joke, our principal at the time, the late Sister Angela Harris of Immaculate, if the place was too messy, she would literally come on the intercom in the day, and we'd have to pause whatever we're doing to clean up the campus. Right? That's how strict she was. So segueing from university, going into segueing from high school going into university now. Similarly to Gashan, right? I'm a alumni of the Department of Geology and Geography at the UW Mona. So in university as well, you get to learn way more about the environment and how the human impact actually has such a wide scale footprint, right? So not just on us, but on different wildlife and so on. And luckily for me, whilst I was in university, that's how I got introduced to the JCCUIC. So I could actually see, okay, we hear about climate change, these big words, these fancy phrases, but what's happening in the local space? What's happening in the youth space, right? So that's where I found out about the work of the JCCUIC, as well as I found out about other young people who are interested in the space. So it wasn't just me, it's a group of connected young people who had bright ideas, big projects in mind that they wanted to do. And I found out as well that the more that we collaborated, the more that there were other interested sponsors as well who wanted to help us go forth with these ideas. So far in my journey, just to sum it up, I found out that there are many more people like us than we think, as well as there are people waiting to hear solutions. And the more that we connect, the more that we ideate, the more that we plan, we can execute meaningful projects. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, and a great experience to have. And that's so true. It's when we go into the space that we see how big the space can be, and can always get bigger. So you were saying what are the local issues? Instead of taking this broad, almost abstract scientific concept, what were the local issues people are experiencing? What's on the ground? How is it impacting the same human and social issues that we keep mentioning but need to get into specifics of? So we want to look at how climate change is affecting the classroom. So it's not just that students need to learn this for the sake of learning, it's that they are also feeling the effects of climate change. So some of those that we discussed in the episode was heat stress, the overheating and overcrowding of the classroom, the lack of access to water, air quality, as some of them. Any of you like to weigh in a little? Have you experienced it in classroom? I know that, well, for me, it's donkey years ago that I was in the classroom. And so we didn't start to feel so many effects of climate change just yet. But then when I was teaching last year, I felt how really horrific it is in the classrooms. The students are begging you to go outside. They cannot concentrate. The heat is too much. Sometimes water go away. We constantly have water shortages every single year. Um, and it's unsanitary. People need to cook and wash their hands. It's children and they'll play around um, in anything. I'll tell you, once rain fell once, which doesn't very happen very often anymore. And the students took off their shoes and ran in the dirty mud because they just it's not something they have that much access to anymore. The nature that we grew up with is very different from the one that we're seeing today. Any thoughts and comments on that?
Yeah, I think preparing for this podcast or reflecting on my own journey, I actually looking back, I was impacted to some degree about climate change, and it was because of climate change when there were at least maybe a couple days out of a year when at high school or even a primary school there was no water and there was no water storage system, and we had to the principal had to postpone school, cancel school for the day. And if you add up those half days or days, that's a good chunk of days that could have been hours dedicated to learning that would have been lost. So there was the that's a very direct impact on learning loss that climate change would have had. Drought, and it could have been infrastructure problems, but it is still considered a drought. Lack of access to water and
Yeah.
things like that. And I was just thinking while you were speaking, David, a lot of the planning, especially in our society by adults around children, are sometimes not as thoroughly thought through. So we sometimes neglect the right of a child. We sometimes take for granted and not look at the granular details of what it means, the right of education. And when we think about how overcrowded our primary schools are, how overcrowded our high schools are. Sometimes upwards of 45 students into a single room, and we know how these classrooms sizes are. And let's not talk about the teacher to children ratio. That's a different thing. We're just talking about the number of people, children, rowdy boys and girls in a classroom in a small space in temperatures, daytime temperatures can get upward of 35 degrees Celsius. And have we stopped to consider the impact of that misery on how different to what degree that has on how a child is able to receive the information, and how they are, teachers able to disseminate that information, and the impacts that would have on the overall learning abilities and output of a country, of a nation, of a school. And I don't think we have reached that stage yet. I don't think we have made that connection to, we are set the stage to think that, or we did it, or grandparents did it, you can too. And we don't realize that things have changed. Even discussing that classrooms should have air conditioned units, some of us, even in our age cohort and older, would say they don't deserve that because we think it's a privilege. When we really look at it, it's almost, it's akin to having water. It's
A
akin to,
necessity at this point.
right, it's a necessity because it affects so much. It affects the basic function of why you get up out of your bed in the mornings to go to school anyway, why you invest in the whole education system. So, and I think that our generation now is being affected to a larger degree by climate issues. Learning loss is being impacted by infrastructural drought. It's being affected by just lack of rainfall. It's being affected by more extreme weather events that cause you to stay home. We see the issues of children playing on fields and they've been struck by lightning. That's a climate change issue. I'm sure, where children are being affected by heat stroke. And let's not talk about getting to the nitty gritty of food insecurity. There's a different layer of the nutrition aspects of students coming to school, and all of that, and even transport to some extent, where just because of their location and their geography, they are unable to get to school because of the terrain, and bridges being washed away and stuff like that. There's so many things that we have to consider, especially in a context, the Jamaican context. I'm just curious as to if there's any study out there being done, or has ever been done, to kind of find the nexus with climate change and learning of the Jamaican people specifically.
Yeah, definitely. Because you just jogged my memory a lot. I withdraw my earlier statement that I didn't experience it
Right.
growing up.
We
But
did.
yeah, we did. And also not just us, but people within our communities at that time. There were times when people weren't able to go to school, and I would see it on the news that their areas flooded. They had to be, sending students across on boats or whatever makeshift material they can get to get them over there through dangerous situations, and that creates learning loss. And then we didn't even touch on the point of hurricanes affecting the schools, and the schools having to recover and rebuild before school starts back in September, when hurricane season not even finish it. Gabrielle.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful point raised earlier, and it helped me to reflect even more. So I can reflect on two different standpoints, one being a teacher and one from the standpoint of being a student. So for the more recent memories of being a teacher, right? I was at a school that was pretty under resourced, right? So I mean, these classrooms, we didn't have fans, so they're built with concrete structures. So at some points in the day, it would be cool, and we're located along the coast, so we'd get some sea breeze and so on, right? But those
Yeah.
classrooms don't have fans, so there are some points in the day when it would still get pretty hot. And in addition to that, I think another point we have to highlight as well for the student experience is that a lot of these students wear very long and very thick uniforms.
Oh, listen.
Listen to me, that's something that we really have to think about in our tropical climate when you have students wearing skirts to their ankles and they have to wear vests as well. That is not conducive to their learning environment. In addition to that, similarly to you, Devia, whenever I was teaching, if we had a water lock off, school would have to end prematurely. We'd have to send the students home. Teachers would have to go home. The canteen members can't prepare the lunches adequately because that's also a health risk. They can't do that. And that
Mm-hmm.
also affects the learning output and contributes to learning loss. And that's something that would happen more than once. You understand? So, in addition to that, even when it rained, we mentioned infrastructure earlier. We need to build with our climate in mind. Because when it would rain, water would wash right into the classroom. The students would have to move their desks away. So, as a teacher, when you see that now and you know that you want to continue a lesson, but your children are literally being impacted, they're being disturbed by what's happening around them, you have to learn how to adjust to that.
Mhm.
So that was one aspect from the teacher standpoint. From a student standpoint, I recalled when I was in high school, so easily 10 years ago, my teacher, I remember my geography teacher at the time, when she was teaching us, the average temperature at that time was between 26 to 27 degrees Celsius. So I'm surprised because 10 years later, we see how drastically that has increased. In addition to that, going to an all girls school, we need to have water all the time. So at one point, water lockouts were too frequent that our principal, what she decided to do was invest in getting way more water tanks across the property, one, as well as investing in better infrastructure in the bathrooms. So we switched out our toilets to having more energy, not energy, but
Water
water use.
conserving.
Yes, that's those types of toilets. So use less volume of water with each flush. But here's the thing now, that also goes back to the resources of various schools. Not every school is able to invest in that and get the water tanks and switch out the toilets and have more cost effective equipment. So the Ministry of Education also has a larger role to play in how it is that they finance these schools and adequately support these schools. Right? So in those two varying experiences, I just wanted to highlight the differences in the resources as well as the approach. And unfortunately, it's an issue that's wide scale across the island. But I definitely think going forward, at least for our students, there have been calls before to review how it is that their uniforms and different uniform regulations are had, potentially review. I know some people have said, okay, on some days, you know how you have PE attire versus your regular school attire, things like that. So, and one other point I remembered, I'm glad we mentioned this is real life, right? When I was in high school, I had a CFEC exam. Guys, we are in May in the rainy season, flash floods happening all over the place. I had an exam, but guess what? That exam still went on. So, in our tropical region, we have to factor that in. Thankfully for my school, what they did, literally the vice principal was still in contact with me and so on, but we still have to address, okay, when we have extreme weather events, how is it that these different exam centers operate? What do you do? Those are practical and real life things. So just some food for thought.
It is because we just take it for granted that this is just how these exams operate. That come hell or high water, exam are keep, and we just knew that from we're young. But the
Yeah.
thing is, we're all humans. Like it's humans that made these exams, and it's we can't pretend that we're in the same world that we started off with,
We
where
really
things
do
are more
act so
stable.
inflexible. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
strange.
And that same inflexibility, I feel like schools and school systems, they think that that's the way to go forward. You have to be inflexible because that's how you instill discipline. And it goes to the school uniforms, it goes to the grooming discussions that they kept having. I remember being so frustrated hearing those discussions, knowing that we had the episode locked in to record around education and thinking, this is why we need climate on the ballot. Because why are people in an election season talking about hairstyles? When we there's
We have other important issues to talk about, and also we it's climate change, but we ended up at grooming because that's how wide of a thing climate change is. And it goes back to the point I was saying that, adults or the Jamaican society has evolved or has continued this trend or this cultural practice of not regarding children as humans, as deserving thought, planning. Why are we wearing skirts all the way down to our ankles, thick khakis, long sleeves, and we can't even have a fair discussion about even addressing these grooming practices. It's kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, to talk about not having a fair discussion, the things that they will bring up about girls and school uniforms, which is not about the girls or the school uniforms. It's about the adults around them that are looking at children.
Hmm.
And then to now look at a student or look at a child and make society's problem their problem. You don't address a societal issue, you address the child, and make life harder for them. That's something that could take us in a whole other direction.
A whole other direction.
But the point about them or us not thinking of them as humans is a very important one, and it starts at childhood because that's a vulnerable class that we need to protect because they don't have the option. They rely on the adults around them, but then it also expands into how we treat ourselves because why are we also in a three-piece suit on a hot working day? Why are the teachers required to as a you know, somebody of my body type, I had real issues finding work clothes for the classroom because not what's acceptable in a regular classroom is not acceptable in a teacher as a teacher. So even if you have like a top that's a little bit of sleeve, which is hard enough for me to find tops with sleeves, but even if it's too little bit of a sleeve, you have to have a jacket over it. And I could not manage with a jacket. And then on top of it, you're in the class overheated, the students are rowdy because that does affect their attitudes and how
It
they interact
does.
with each other.
It does.
There were times when students would just be playing football in the class and there's nothing I could say to them to get them to, because to them, it's just playing is the way to like get away from what's happening
The
and
misery.
they're the misery of it. So if you're already sweating, you'd rather be sweating and playing football than sweating and sitting in the class. Um, there's one of the recommendations is to take them outside, and there's only so many spaces that you can go outside. In terms of what's available in shading, uh, people tend not to want trees for some reason around their school buildings. One of the vice principals said we were talking about a planting project, and she said we have too many trees, and I was like, too many. And we didn't. There were just three trees that we could choose from to go have a class on, though. But yes, it's one of those things where we don't know where the mental. I see in the chat colonial mentality, and it must be that
Look,
because where is the
and
mentality coming
no,
from?
but and climate change activism strikes at the heart of colonialism in many regards. Food systems, the uniforms, grooming, recognizing the right of a child, it just strikes at the heart of colonialism. And that's why climate justice is not just global warming. It's not just, oh, the weather is changing. It can get really, it it will upend all systems if we look at it realistically, and that is why I take it so seriously. Climate change, climate justice, and intersectionality across all people.
That's exactly it. When you were saying people are talking about how they don't deserve ACs, not seeing their humanity, just thinking about what you went through, and we, because of the continued trauma through our generations, um, everyone thinks about what they're going through or what they went through and think that it's okay. But one, things are changing in terms of the calamity is harsher. And two, even if you went through it, how can we as a nation, and we very much focus on performance, how can you look at performance as a clinical thing that just happens, that students just perform well and you see it declining and you think, oh, it's just they're just lazy, oh, it's the TikTok, oh, it's some of these students don't even have phones. They don't have access to a lot of things that you think they have access to, for one. Like you think they're very much into technology, they were struggling with that as well. So you think they're just struggling with literacy or math. They really are struggling with every single thing across the board.
Yeah.
Um, so it's something that you have to look at. It's not isolated. It's not based off of one student or the other. It's a continuous systemic thing that's happening in our education system, and climate change is a huge part of that. So we
Right.
have to really consider where we're going. One of the things that we discussed on the episode was who are the players that are involved. We talked about
Mhm.
the students and the teachers, of course, but we also need to talk about the society and the parents, the home, the community. How are they involved? How do we get these discussions to be more important? When the grooming issue was happening, I started to wonder because anytime these topics come up, or government officials will always leave it in the hands of the educators or the schools themselves because they don't want to micromanage, they want to be more hands off. But principals and even teachers have a lot of power. Lots of power in the classroom, a lot of power over what happens when you show up to this place that you have to be in. It's not an option, you know. The students have to be there, and then you force them there, and then this is how you treat them when you do. So I was trying to think of how parents can get more involved. Usually the PTA is called by the school itself, and there's like a running list of things that they'll discuss. But what if you as a parent, you don't want to see your child locked out of school because they had a different hairstyle? You want to make sure that your child is safe and comfortable in a classroom. How do you get these issues across? Um, how do you garner like donations for things like fans? Because some schools don't even have fans when they're talking about AC. Some schools don't even have the basic of that. Um, what is the community and parental involvement that's needed here? And maybe I already explained it in the question.
No, I was slightly distracted right now. I'm in the tail end there. But the last part you made, Did just remind us of that just now.
Oh, just the idea of parental involvement in the school system,
Right,
community
yeah, the
involvement.
stakeholders, right, the stakeholders, who is actually involved, who can actually make the change. Um, I keep on my mind keep on going back to keeps on going back to the point where we have to see children as equals. We have to recognize children. We have to recognize the right of a child. And we have to just see their humanity. And once we get to that, and if you're not in the Jamaican society, I perhaps might want to think that you might not understand what I mean by that. But a lot of things we take for granted when it comes to planning our own children. So one, I would start with investing more from the budget in terms of in education and infrastructure. That is one. It is also doing studies that not just require the outputs, how much CXC students are getting, not the quantitative side of things, but the qualitative side of things. You know, um, I saw a study the other day that said that Jamaican children are developing diabetes, childhood diabetes, and hypertension. Those chronic diseases are to some extent dietary related, but they're also very much related to other stresses, environmental stresses like heat stress, and those things can cause inflammation in the body. I'm no public health scientist here or nutritionist, but I do know that those stresses can cause chronic diseases in the body. To what extent is climate change affecting chronic diseases in our children? And until the research goes into that area, until we start seeing policies being guided by those research being funneled into education planning, then I'll start to take things seriously. But it has to come from, I think, an authority, which is the government. Most of our schools in Jamaica are public schools. So the schools are guided by public policies. and they're guided and essentially governed by the government of Jamaica. You mentioned that a lot of the powers are kind of delegated to administrators. Now, a friend of mine described a lot of times these administrators as kings and queens in their petty kingdoms. So they make these schools their domain, and they say, oh, the Ministry of Health can talk to us. The Ministry of Health or Education should be able to talk to you and should be able to set these grounded principles and guidelines as how to treat children, how to deal with these issues. You know, things like overcrowding of classrooms. I know it is tied to the financial resources, but we have financial resources to do other things. We sure can invest into fixing the classroom, building more schools, making these schools cool enough. Um, you know, planning future schools with the idea that there might be water restrictions, there might be heat related situations, and we might need to start mandating schools to start funding or finding funds somewhere to solarize the school, and to find, as what Gabriel I think said, more water efficient toilets and bathroom infrastructures, and those things. But it has to come from somewhere. A central source, an authority has to recognize the issue and has to push it down, and has to put it in policy, has to put it in developmental frameworks and M&E policies and all of that. I'm going forward.
Yeah, of course.
And it will eventually reach the parents. And the parents do know about it, The parents do know that, they have something is happening, but they're unable to put their fingers on it. And a lot of times it's because the child is just not in an environment conducive enough for learning.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We do need a push for it to go to the very top, and we're hoping that these conversations can keep that in the minds of people, because as much as the top down is the best way for things to happen, and we keep saying it over and over again as advocates, we're constantly from the bottom trying to get to the top, and it's exhausting, and it sometimes doesn't reach where it needs to be. But we still need that voice to go out there, and we need it to be heard. So we do need parents at the front lines talking in your PTAs, bringing it up to whoever at higher and higher levels. Um, and we need more discussions like these, more petitions, more advocacy for our students, because they can't do this on their own. They can't do it. They don't have the options. So if you're forcing them to be in a classroom, then make that classroom climate smart, climate sensitive, and consider their experience. Because it helps the society in general. They need to learn, and this is how they learn. And we have the science to back it up. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. You still have access to the episode, Climate on the Ballot, episode 1, which is around education. And this live will be available anytime as well. Very important discussions. I'm so glad you're all able to weigh in. We'll see you next time. We'll meet every other week for our live shows. So we'll have our recorded episode with our guests next week, available next week. And then the following Saturday, you'll see us again on the live talking about jobs. See you all. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye bye.
All right. And to our listeners, remember you can write in with the subject line Climate on the Ballot to orfootprintja@gmail.com. That's orfootprintja